So I've got to get this underway, and my cat has been on my lap for a little bit, so I'll let her be here and try to speak. I'll try to pick up from where I left off the other day, or not from where I left off, but from one of the kind of loose ends or things that I said that still requires qualification. I'll try to get better at these so that I don't have to do video after video qualifying things that I've said, and try to be a little more concise. Um, but I'll just continue going with whichever topics or things that I've suggested till some more relations and commuting goes on. So to pick up, one of the things that I said was philosophy is a self-conscious way of relating and communicating. So the first time around, we traversed some of the tensions regarding relating and communicating in a medium that might belie the very attempt to communicate. So to have philosophical goals of relating and communicating in a medium like the internet or like YouTube might ultimately deny that very attempt to relate. So we did the tensions of relating and communicating, but not the self-conscious part. So philosophy as a self-conscious way of relating and communicating, the self-conscious part still needs to be qualified. So it calls to be qualified in the terms of which it has come up. So like instead of just giving a definition, so like I've been saying, instead of just like giving a definition in advance of self-consciousness, as if I could go to the dictionary, or as if there's a theory of self-consciousness that I need to go and appeal to, I'll just try to raise it in the terms that have already been addressed. So I won't be giving a kind of definition of self-consciousness, but I'll be trying to develop the meaning of the term by kind of, again, continuing along the tensions of developing the term itself. I know it sounds a little tricky, but I think we'll get there if we can follow the line of thought. It's just a different way of developing the meaning of something, or coming to the meaning of something without having a dictionary definition in advance. So one of the things that I want to claim is that the way that philosophy is self-conscious is as a tradition. So one of the things that qualifies the meaning of self-consciousness, the meaning of a philosophical persona or community, is that it's traditional in some sense, but not merely traditional, because of course there can be all kinds of traditions. But there's some content, some variable about that tradition that qualifies it as philosophical, or has an aspect of it that makes it philosophical. So there are a couple ways that I'll get to the idea of walk right over my notes. Excuse me. Excuse me. Hey you. I'm trying to work here. So I'll just try to read out from under the pause. So like there's a background disposition that people have that we move around in, that we tend to live in. It's just our day-to-day, I don't know how else to describe it other than the ways that we're disposed to act. And everybody has their own particular idiosyncratic ways that they're disposed to act. And I know we can think of this as a set or as a procedure or something, and then something new comes along, something calls you to act in a new way or understand something in a new way. So something new is required to make sense of something that strikes you in a way that is other than your regular background way of just dispositionally moving around in the world. Another way to put this is you have your way of being in the world, and then something arrives or calls you in such a way that when you respond to it, you're now in a new world of some sort, where now that you've responded to this thing that seemed new, or that you needed something new to help make sense of, by your very response to it, it's kind of got in the door, so to speak, and has proceeded to systematically reorient the furniture in the room, the contents of the world. So when something new happens, it's possible to kind of get into a new worldview, and these kind of things happen all the time. So it doesn't even have to be like this kind of overly magical idea of philosophers being these people carrying around worldviews in their pocket or something like that. We can think of this as like, I don't know, a kid learning that some fairy tale character isn't real. Um, I don't know, just growing up in general, arriving in adulthood, you don't believe the things that you believed when you were a child, and there were certain key moments when new data, so to speak, arrived to you or came to you, and you were called to either disregard it in some sense or pay heed to it in such a way that you became reoriented because of this thing that you live in. So there's a background disposition or set of assumptions that people have that can be systematically affected based on how they respond to moments of novelty. We call those events. We could call these backgrounds, horizons. So people, I think, in general, just have these. We get them from being embodied. We get them from culture. We get them from being selves and other people. But there are also circumstances in which we wittingly constitute certain kinds of dispositions in people, and I mean this almost a play on the word constitution, where you can have like a state whose basic laws or procedures are laid out in their constitution, and those procedures are to some extent and in some way supposed to be the internal disposition of the citizens, such that they conduct themselves in accord with that constitution laid out explicitly publicly. So constitution is kind of like an external version of everybody's background disposition laid out for you to have. But there are all kinds of constitutions. So like I just gave the example of a state. One can come to be constituted within certain groups. I'm thinking of appropriating something that I think Richard Rorty said, and it had to do with how intellectuals make decisions among groups, and the sentiment or the quip was basically that different groups have different practices and activities and have read one set of books versus a different set of books. So insofar as everyone rallies around a certain set of procedures and texts and vocabularies, they'll be constituted in similar ways. So you can constitute groups of people based on kind of setting forth or understanding what their shared parameters of meaning are. So the things that give them not a shared sense of meaning, but a set of parameters that allow a shared set of meanings to be intelligible to them as a group. So groups are constituted by their shared parameters of meaning, and that shared parameter of meaning is a constitution that everybody embodies as a background or as a disposition. But there's a quantitative aspect to groups that kind of fall together around constitution. So we're moving from background to constitution to tradition, not quite yet at the level of tradition, because I think that a constitution is something that has a quantitative aspect where if you want to be in our club and fit the charter or for our reading group or something like that, kind of absurd, then you have to have read books X, Y, R, B, just fill in the variables. Or if you want to be part of this philosophy tradition, then you've got to have read this text. Or if you want to join the army, you've got to have done these things. So there's a quantitative, almost a list of things that you could do to fit the constitution of a given group. A tradition is a kind of self-updating constitution. There's a pun in there where it's self-updating in the sense of it kind of organically changes over time, it updates, but also it updates the selves that are kind of binded to this constitution. So what this means is like not merely that there's a one-way relationship between the selves and the constitution, but also that when you, insofar as the selves make the constitution, but also that once the constitution is made, it makes the selves. So there's a self-updating aspect that when you change the constitution, the selves that are allied to it are also updated, changed. Um, so let's see. We can think of a tradition as a constitution stretched out in time, as the lives lived in the group set by that constitution. The tradition is knowingly the substance of the people in the tradition. Parameters are set on updating the tradition because that would mean updating all the selves. Yeah, so there's like a whole judiciary or bureaucracy that's set up around being able to update a constitution, knowing wholly well that it would reorient all of the selves as well. So a pardon me, a tradition is in some sense capable of acting on itself. So there are some implications here because, like, again, just to keep in mind, we're trying to clarify what self-consciousness is, and I've claimed that to do that in this way at this point would be to claim that philosophy is a tradition of some kind. So we're just teasing out, developing the meaning of tradition before we get to self-consciousness. So there's some implications of like this kind of structure of having a background and the way that constitutions work, and then the way that tradition is like a self-updating constitution. Some of the implications are not merely that one internalizes certain agreed upon thinkers, texts, projects, etc., but that a systematic orientation alongside one's cohorts is taken up. So one joins a group and takes on their practices and tries to make them systematically intelligible to the other people in the group who have done the same thing. So we do this when we're kids growing up. We do this when we join a dance class or something. We try to show that we're working along similar lines or trying to be intelligible, systematically intelligible to our cohorts and take up the practices and understandings that they have. And it's not merely about agreeing upon certain thinkers, texts, and projects, but about being able to embed oneself in a set of traditional activities and, importantly, personal cognitive gestures. And I'll have more to say about this personal cognitive gestures part of this because that seems to be like the proof in the pudding. Any tradition kind of fits the structures that I've laid out at this point, but even philosophy and the army, for example, all fall within the line of kind of embodying a certain set of shared group parameters and traditional activities, but it's the personal cognitive gestures, the things that are different about the philosophers because they do them different than the army or a book club, that makes them philosophers. So I'll have more to say about the personal cognitive gestures later, because like we're still trying to figure out what makes any of this really philosophical. Because at this point, just to reiterate, we could be describing a child being enculturated, or someone joining a cult, or someone falling into a political ideology, or like I said, attending a book club, or entering into a relationship, or joining an army. All of these things they kind of fit the definition or the description that I've given thus far of this background disposition that has a relationship to events and novelty and the constitution and traditions. All of these things fit that structure. So I've got written here, traditions, cultures, societies, shared vocabularies, and practices give rise to and are generally continuous as the experiences of the people living within them. They are the background dispositions set forth as the presuppositions that, without themselves even needing to appear, order and make intelligible shared activities. So we can set aside these shared traditional activities because we are yet to agree on what our supposed shared tradition entails. So like we don't in advance agree on what the tradition of philosophy would entail, so we can't therefore in advance go down the path of trying to figure out what the shared traditional activities of a philosophy tradition would be. We would have to focus on the personal cognitive gestures. But it's important to point out that philosophy as a tradition shows signs of being a different kind of tradition. But at this point in time, it's like penicillin and moldy bread. So we can what this means is that we can superficially tell that there's a distinction between a book club and a philosophy club, or an English degree and a philosophy degree. There's supposed to be some kind of difference there that can still be qualified at this point, again along the lines of those personal cognitive gestures. But the metaphor was penicillin and moldy bread, so the idea is even at this point in time, we don't really have a concrete example of philosophy being a kind of self-conscious discipline. At this point in time, this is what I'm claiming tacitly at this point, is to be a self-conscious discipline, you would have to kind of be a tradition that knowingly sets up its own conditions, but in a further need to be qualified philosophical way. But even at this point in time, it's not clear that philosophy is doing that or is self-conscious in that way that I just suggested, because my experience anyway, is they'll throw 4 years of generally random thinking at you, and hope that you come out the other side as a thinker or as a philosopher of some kind. And it's rather regular that a lot of people don't come out the other side feeling as if they're philosophers. Some do, and then the question is, well, something in there, that thing that still calls to be qualified, made it so that those people in particular became philosophers, as opposed to conversationists or rhetoricians or English majors. Something in that moldy bread of the university acted like penicillin and made these people philosophical in this philosophically qualified way. But then, like I just said, it's a tradition that self-consciously reproduces its own conditions. So like even the army does that. Like it's got its own discourse and pedagogy for like generation after generation, knowing how to recruit and produce soldiers. And it does that at a kind of apparently anyway greater rate of success than philosophy as a discourse is producing philosophers. So even something like philosophy that would claim something like self-consciousness doesn't seem to be putting it on display in its own form of discourse. Other things are doing it better. So it's possible to come out the other side of a 4-year stint at the university with a degree in philosophy and not know whether one is a philosopher. Or it's even worse, it's possible to come out the other side doing bad philosophy. That might be what's happening here. What's important to remember again is that somebody has supposedly been a philosopher, that we can keep an eye toward the importance of that moment, the event, that particular instance of novelty that was capable of acting as an entrance to the new world of a tradition. So think back to what I mentioned about the background, or one's disposition in the beginning. When one encounters something new that was capable of, that new thing was capable of, in some sense, reorienting the entirety of one's whole world, the way that they experience things. What's important to kind of escape the moldy bread and gain a self-consciousness higher than an army, for example, is that, okay, philosophy can't just accidentally be producing philosophers. There needs to be something in there that is a sufficient condition of doing this. But at the same time, it can't be quantified like the Constitution was, a kind of list of set rules where it's like, okay, now we know it's not an accident because you've read X, Y, R, and B texts. So it can't be quantified, but it can't be quantified overtly like that, but it also can't be carried out accidentally. So we're still pressed. What makes a tradition self-conscious or philosophical? The picture is of moldy bread, but of the possibility that some people are philosophers. So a claim that I would make then at this point is to try to answer the question, what makes a tradition self-conscious or philosophical? We could move forward by suggesting that the tradition would have to traverse the aforementioned conditions wittingly. So it would have to know that the self has this kind of background or disposition that they kind of move around in the world in accordance with, and are or something. It would have to know that its discourse would have to be quantified in that constitutional way of giving somebody a disposition of some kind. And it would have to self-update its tradition in a way that didn't allow the tradition to dissolve, but at the same time wouldn't overly quantify the tradition so as to merely be something that once you fit the Constitution, now you're a philosopher because you've fit X, Y, R, and B. So it'd have to wittingly traverse all these conditions. So as opposed to just winding up a soldier and not knowing how and why one did that, the philosopher is in some sense pressed to explain how and why they became a philosopher. So they would have a kind of self-consciousness of how they came to be who and what they are. So the ones who made it out the maw of the other side of the university are called to answer, how and why did you become a philosopher? What were the conditions that allowed you to arrive in that philosophically qualified state of mind or way of being in the world? So a self-conscious tradition of philosophy would be called to account for those conditions wittingly, and to redeploy the conditions that produced that very traditional disposition. So a tradition as such has practices, not doctrine. So, for example, think of Descartes' meditations and of the kind of thought experiment that's in there, where you can have a moment of like, well, you're just moving around. This is your first exposure to philosophy 101, for example, and you haven't had much exposure to philosophy. We could just keep that in mind or pretend at this point. And you hear the brain in the vat when your professor is telling you, or somebody is telling you about reading Descartes in class, and they tell you about the brain in the vat, and you've never thought of something like that being a possibility, but now you're in your imagination thinking, yeah, I guess it's possible. If my experience is wholly the result of physiologically produced sensations, then I could very well just be a kind of nervous system or a brain in a vat that is having this sensory world produced by stimuli other than the way that the world actually is. So as a thought experiment, one can kind of get this goes back to that dispositional thing where this new idea acts in some sense as a way of updating systematically one's worldview, but then like one can see and ask, why are there some people who aren't reoriented by this possibility or aren't affected by this metaphysic, or they're capable of kind of borderlining on seeing the potential pedagogical importance of entertaining that thought experiment in their imagination wholly, but they still resist to, or they refuse the import of it. Pardon me. That moment is capable of acting as something that, like I was saying a moment ago, I'll start that sentence again. A tradition has practices, not doctrine. So when the meditations are read in the sense of something like a thought experiment, or in the sense of something like following an argument or following a logic, I think the point of reading it is missed. So like on one level, the content of that text will be important if we want it to be a philosophical tradition, as in the content of the meditations is particular to our tradition, so read it as you go forward. But that's an aside. The point that I'm trying to make here is that reading a philosophical text or reading a text philosophically is a matter of treating the text as a way of getting into a worldview, as opposed to kind of having one of these thought experiment like moments of just being able to possibly entertain being a brain in a vat. One wants to rather follow out the entirety of the Cartesian meditations, not to have this kind of quick possible flash of what a thought experiment could do, but to be able to get into the entirety of that world that Descartes laid out as a practice. So it's not like it's I read this, now I know the logic and the argument that Descartes used without it having any cognitive effect on you. The whole point is that it's supposed to have some kind of cognitive effect on your worldview, so that when you read the text, you're not reading a set of arguments, but you're reading what Descartes, in this example, laid out as a series of approximate conditions of possibility that once you've traversed them, you can, like I suggested in the beginning, snap into this kind of new world by having traversed something that appeared to be new to you faithfully, meeting the conditions to be able to get into it that the philosopher prior spells out. So this is kind of what's meant by like redeploys the conditions that produced it. Where if Descartes is a philosopher in this example, then Descartes then they know what their meditations are. The self that Descartes is already has the meditations in it, or it is the meditation, so to speak. And then when they write the meditations, they are leaving for us or for others the conditions of possibility of getting to know Descartes, of getting into that worldview, so that you yourself, from that same background, since they left the Constitution for you, since you can give yourself that same background, now you can look at the world from where Descartes was. You yourself could write the meditations because now you've taken up that same sense of self that Descartes had when he wrote the meditations. And if he did a good enough job when he wrote the meditations, then when you meet these conditions, you'll be better at reproducing it. Philosophers that don't meet those conditions well or are obscure, it's more difficult to be able to get into their worldview, or their variant more interpretations of them, in a sense. But all of that is kind of an aside. So what I want to suggest at this point is like to go back to the moldy bread at the university, to offer up philosophy as if it's a series of thought experiments. To do philosophy as if it's merely thought experiments is merely to kind of like do this kind of like peculiar edifying thing. So a thought experiment presents philosophy as though the content of your intuition is what your philosophizing is about. So the brain in a vat thing is supposed to be like, well, how could I be a brain in the vat? Is that intuitively a possibility? Or which way should I pull the switch on this trolley problem given the variant? Like I was saying, those are mere moments of offering up philosophy as if it's supposed to be your amateur or naive or everyday background response to the problem, and that's what you're supposed to try to defend, as opposed to, because like a thought experiment frames it as if it's like, oh, your immediate response is what you're supposed to try to defend, when the whole point of a thought experiment is that it's merely a part of a philosopher's greater worldview, and that it's that worldview that you're trying to get into. So I want to make the distinction here between a thought experiment that gets pitched in philosophy versus a thought exercise that treats events or texts within the tradition as abilities to come knowingly to inhabit a new worldview by following the conditions for getting into that world laid out in the works of that tradition. So again, one is attempting to see the world through the eyes of the philosopher who left the text behind. So to reiterate, philosophy is not merely to be read as a stringing together and following an apparently coherent line of thought, or about checking the logic of an argument, or about being right or rhetorically interesting. Those are important, but it's of greater importance to charitably attempt to get where the philosopher is coming from. And that's, again, not a procedure that could be given in advance as a constitution quantitatively, nor is it something that could just be shot from the gun as if one already knows it. It's a practice. It's a way of life that one kind of develops by exercising their thinking. So moving forward, one could say philosophy attempts to provide the conditions for certain worldviews and entering into those worldviews. It attempts to account for how a tension or a question arises by addressing the background out of which that attempt has itself arisen. A question, for example, is interesting, therefore, not only for what the question asks, but equally for the background suppositions that expose as presuppositions in the asking of the question. Sorry, that was grammatically wrong. A question is interesting not only for what it says, but for exposing the background presuppositions that are tacit, implicit within the question itself. So a question itself always has presuppositions, doesn't just arrive from nowhere. One starts with that background of understanding, and then a question or a tension or an impasse will arise in relation to that already existing background. So when a question arises out of that, it's already possessed of the presuppositions that were tacitly held in the background. So one could say that in regard to these events, these tensions, these questions, these impasses, philosophy is a way of orienting towards those in a way that recognizes that the background, constitutional, traditional origins of the question are present in the question, the address, and the response to the event itself. There are implications of this. So one of the implications is that there is to claim that there are origins that events arise from, that these moments of possibly being able to become something new do have some kind of concrete origins, because sometimes one does actually become something new concretely. Another implication is that philosophy has a systematic and rigorous eye toward those origins in the hopes of being able to reproduce them and thereby reproduce the worldviews and insights produced by them. So reading Descartes is not merely to have the insight or the intuition, the edification offered by the brain in the vat style thought experiment, but to live toward reproducing and qualifying the conditions and content of the world that the work implies, which is a practice of appropriating a self, not only the self that reads Descartes, but of appropriating a kind of picture of Descartes through the practice of trying to get into that background world that was the set of presuppositions out of which the meditations themselves arose. So what this suggests then, what makes philosophy distinct in one sense from other traditions at this point, is not merely its way of trying to self-consciously approach these events as novel ways of getting into new worlds, and not merely its practice, its way of treating philosophical texts as practices of getting into new worlds, but that as a tradition it's not about being immersed in a single world. It's not about being a soldier or of being a manager or an accountant. It's about a series of worlds. There's a continual self-appropriation of oneself by charitable exposure to many worlds. Philosophy, as a tradition, is about how to get into many worlds. This is the process of self-consciousness. So what self-consciousness is implying in some sense is that it's possible to get into many worlds. How can we get into many worlds? It's possible to know how to get into many worlds and to lay out the conditions for being able to get into different ways of looking at the world. There's a lot of things here that I think will come up, but at this point there are more implications that could be drawn out. This is a borrowed point. There's no real anterior to philosophizing. So as soon as one's like moving around in the world, that background disposition that one has moving around, one could already treat that as a form of questioning, whereby moment to moment you're scanning to see whether the world is still the same and updating in a sense. So just in a background sense, that's kind of trivially true. But more importantly, as soon as one has this encounter with an event, is drawn to ask a question, faces attention, lives attention, as soon as one is drawn to question that, as soon as one's called to question, as soon as one recognizes self-consciously that they are called to question, they're already philosophizing. So a condition of the possibility of philosophizing self-consciously is being able to address these tensions as such when they arise, and then that very condition of being able to do so is also the fulfillment of having done so, because it's also to address the very fact that one has been brought to questioning. So it's recognizing that one has been brought to questioning, and the very act of questioning itself fulfills the conditions of doing philosophy. The only way to not be philosophical explicitly is to turn one's back on these instances in which something new could happen, to overtly try to not get into different worldviews. One's still tacitly a philosopher insofar as they're questioning just by moving around in the world, but that's that trivial thing that I just suggested a moment ago. But they're turning their back on explicitly philosophizing insofar as they don't approach the question and don't fulfill and posit the conditions of philosophy in the very act of questioning, and don't recognize that they're doing that. We can start to say some things about the self in self-consciousness at this point. So through exposure to many worlds, the philosopher participates with and appropriates many senses. They appropriate them to their own background, to their own understanding. So I almost want to say senses here in like the physiological, I almost mean that in the physiological way, where you have touch and vision, for example, and there are other senses. There's like a Cartesian sense, or a Lockean sense, or a Humean sense. Each of these philosophical worldviews has a particular sense to it that when you're capable of getting in and out of these many worldviews, you develop this reciprocal relation, this sense of that worldview that isn't just therefore out there in the worldviews that you could come to inhabit the many worldviews, but has a kind of continuity with the self that is the one switching among the many worldviews. So there's a kind of synthetic self that's appropriated, and a synthetic self-appropriating. So what this means is there's a resultant self of a kind of synthesis of all of the worldviews, but then this very act of moving through each of the worldviews is the act of synthesizing this very self. So I'm not merely the self of any world that I take up, but I'm also the very background set of dispositions as well that's appropriating itself and participating with itself. This is what it means to make sense of life. This is what it means to be self-conscious, is to be synthetically appropriating that self and to be aware of being that process of synthetically appropriating that self, where what's synthesized are the senses from the different worldviews that the philosopher can come to inhabit. Self-consciousness is synonymous with making sense. And it's not, this is a higher way of using the term making sense. So there are implications now of this. the thinker that moves world to world and self to self is one of the selves. So synthesizing all of the senses from the worlds, there's that synthetic self. So that's one of my selves that is not and is other than each of these other ones. So there's that one. And it's also that background dispositional horizon that one brings to bear on the world. Like I suggested, one is that and responsible for that. So you are that horizon in some sense, and you're responsible for qualifying how and why certain experiences or senses are or are not available to you. So if one claims to have a sense from a particular world, one is thereby on trial to explicate how to be able to get into that world so as to arrive at a similar sense. Likewise, one's supposed to be able to explain how and why some things are nonsense to them, where they ought not to be able to arrive at a certain thing making sense. I've kind of got not in mind at this point. So you are responsible for qualifying how and why certain experiences or senses are or are not available to you. So maybe, I hope this isn't confusing, because I mean it in a parallel way. It's not exactly the same, but I've heard Slavoj Žižek give examples on Kant's duty, Kant's notion of duty, where not only are you responsible and thereby autonomous for following your duty, but you're responsible for providing the provisions for giving yourself that duty as a particular duty to begin with. So you're radically free. Yeah, like you're not only autonomous, but also radically free. Not only autonomous to follow one's duty, but you're free to give yourself duty or to not to give yourself duty. So there's a kind of background sense in this example within oneself that one can yoke out of them in order to give themselves a moral sense that one either gives themselves the moral sense or does not in this example, and is on trial for whether they can or cannot or do or don't. I hope that kind of fits the example, but it's not quite what I'm getting at. Anyway, to move forward, I think I mentioned personal cognitive activities a couple of times in confusing ways. So there are personal cognitive activities that are particular to philosophy as discussed thus far. Not only that all of these implications are presupposed as capacities or abilities that the philosopher has or can come to have, but also that philosophy, when thought of as a tradition, is a kind of metaphorical coming to terms with one's imagination, or coming to terms with a philosophical imagination. Because recall the examples earlier, like joining a book club or joining the army. When you're a soldier, the world as a soldier is real for you. When you're politically mobilized, the world looks that way to you. So there's a kind of reality that one is in. There's a realness to these worlds that one is in within particular traditions that, again, philosophy, this is kind of one of those markers or things that makes philosophy distinct from the other traditions, is that this kind of synthetic self that comes out the other side of the philosophical moldy bread, the maw, is a kind of ironic, pessimistic, or suspicious gaze to the reality of there being any essential self among these particular worlds. So, like, if it's possible to get into and out of all of these disparate selves and many worlds, one can ask why myself in this world is not just one of those things, and if I am truly inhabiting other selves and other worlds, couldn't I just not be a particular other person or inhabit a different world? There's nothing essential about me inhabiting any particular world or even about my particular world. So why is there this kind of ironic or suspicious gaze? because the philosopher comes to have a negative knowing of how to disqualify some of the worldviews that they're in. Many naive political affiliations are discredited. Many bad questions can be thrown out. Nobody really tries to save Descartes anymore, so there's a kind of negative knowing as to how to disqualify worldviews and selves. So in that sense, one's suspicious or ironic about these kind of selves and their reality. So there's a negative knowing about how to disqualify, but there's an affirmative knowing of this aforementioned existentially open and synthetic self. So there's an affirmative knowing of a self that one knows that one is precisely because one has appropriated that self out of a relation to their background and other possible worlds and selves. So in other words, philosophy knows its conditions. The philosopher knows the background and how to orient it so as to enter into many different worlds. The tradition of philosophy then is of people explicating their worlds and or the conditions that they suppose or approximate are responsible for producing those selves and worlds. So there's kind of a pun to be had here between the exercising of the imagination, the coming to terms with the imagination, the thought exercising from earlier, where one exercises the imagination by traversing different worlds with a systematic gaze towards recollecting, as a self, the conditions and parameters of sharing those worlds. So this kind of like cartoonish figure in my head of philosophers with all these worlds. What are they supposed to do with all these worlds? You're supposed to look at this one and look at this one and make this one, do it, like make one of these worlds and lay it out for somebody else and see if somebody else can get into it. Kind of cartoonish figure of being able to produce and create worlds and share them, maybe in a highfalutin magical sense. I don't see other creatures doing this. But there's a second sense, like I suggested, of exercise, where like it's an exorcism, where part of the persona, the synthetic developed self, is not something that one could have planned to be in advance, or one would even know what it would look like in advance, because it's kind of a resultant product of the worldviews that one decides to traverse through going through a tradition. And in not knowing what the self is going to be in advance, not only do you not know who you're going to be, but you wittingly go about losing track of who you are supposed to be, such that you could be any one of these possible selves in any one of these many worlds. Again, it's kind of echoing that point that if I can be any one of these, then there's no essential one that I necessarily am. And in this regard, one is exorcised of there being any particular essential self that one is in advance. So the hope of a philosophical tradition, if it's capable of not being moldy bread, but is like I hope to suggest, capable of approximating its conditions knowingly over time as a self-updating tradition, self-appropriating synthetic tradition, the hope of a philosophical tradition that qualifies the tradition as a philosophical tradition is the production or the appropriation of a synthetic, eclectic, systematic self that knows its own conditions and can rigorously approximate and reproduce them. The picture here is that enough thinkers in the tradition will recollect, explicate, live out, institutionalize, and reproduce themselves in a shared constitutional manner over time, so as to arrive at more and more comprehensive persons and communities. So it's like, oh, that's never played out in time, actually. It doesn't work like that. I would claim that philosophy has never worked like this in this self-conscious traditional way. If we had something like this, we're not sure how well something like that would work out. One of the goals of attempting philosophical relationships is precisely trying to be and build these kind of personas and to see how they play themselves out over time. So insofar as the tradition can produce more and more comprehensive forms of selfhood over time, there is kind of great leaps forward from a self that is in any particular world to a self that traverses a whole basket of worlds, in a sense. So it was one thing for Kant to be Kant. That's a high enough achievement in some sense to be able to orient the world coherently like that. But there are people today who know Kant and Plato and Husserl and Derrida, and they know all of these thinkers because they spent years on them personally and individually. So the self that that person is, if they're getting into these thinkers as worldviews, as opposed to list of arguments and theories that you can put down at the end of the day, if they're getting into these worldviews, then by definition they're synthetically more comprehensive than the very thinkers whose worldviews they're synthesizing as their very own self. So there are thinkers today that are moving around with thousands of years of philosophical knowledge that the worlds within those traditions couldn't have seen, but that the thinker themselves, if they're living in the tensions of those worlds and traversing them and knowing how to move world to world in some sense, then the selves of today philosophically are systematically, synthetically more comprehensive than the ones in the past. And it's just a matter of kind of knowing which ones to traverse. There's a kind of that's the next step. There's suggestive here a kind of developmental structure. So this goes back to what's the content of our tradition going to be. If we don't agree on that in advance, then we're still called to decide what are the highest moments that philosophers have hit. So it's like which of these branches within the traditions that we have are actually the ones that are close to the top of the tree, just to keep the metaphor. Who's getting higher and higher and more comprehensive? How do we tell? That's part of the ongoing conversation that the tradition itself needs to be able to have, but it's presupposed here as, okay, if you are wittingly capable of recounting all of the conditions that allowed you to arise to asking a question or being a philosophical persona, if you're capable of recounting all those conditions and how to meet them and how to lay them out, then you're basically explicating your development. You're saying, I developed through this and this and this, and these are the conditions of me being this developed synthetic self. So the claim of the philosopher would be that there is a developmental structure either to the self or to philosophical pedagogy that one can actually come to learn or find out, that there's a ladder in you in some sense. So philosophy as a self-conscious tradition is possessed of a developmental structure. This is an implication. If the philosopher can comprehensively account for the conditions that led them to an event or to their own moments and worlds that led to them being the self that they are, then they are basically explicating their very own development. And to explicate one's very own development is also, again, to be monotonous about this, is to not have a theory. It's not about having any particular theory, but of knowing oneself so as to explicate what led one to be the self that they are, and to explicate the way that the world, through the gaze of all these worlds, looks to them. So one doesn't need a theory, one is the theory, and the traversing of what led them to be where they are, and the recollection of that traversing so that somebody else could go through those steps so as to arrive at where one is, or approximate where one is. Socrates only exists in speech. One doesn't need to theorize as a philosopher because one's own self is the product of their endeavor, of their self-incurred development. So they don't need to theorize, but they can traverse the theoretical tensions that their development supposedly overcomes. So what that means is, like, for example, suppose that there is a kind of figure who is stuck in a kind of a faulty version of what science is. They're a bit dogmatic about science. They're in a faulty version of empiricism or something. The philosopher that we've now qualified as being part of a tradition where they themselves see, oh, I was in this position of a kind of faulty empiricism, or I know the worldviews that lead to this kind of faulty empiricism, and I've passed through those faulty worldviews and those conditions so that I can now recollect and explicate for another how and why to move forward through that. So a philosopher that is traditionally qualified knows how to get into how the world looks to the other so as to disqualify the nascent aspects of that world, so the contradictory aspects, but also, more importantly, the philosopher in this traditionally qualified sense also knows how to take the assumptions of that faulty worldview to their fulfillment, so that that world passes over of its own accord. So what this means is that there's a kind of knowing that the philosopher develops that each one of these worldviews and selves is ultimately going to be discordant or contradictory and will need to pass over into a different kind of worldview and a self. What the philosopher then embodies, as opposed to this person who didn't know, the faulty empiricist, for example, they are embodying a kind of self-conscious diagnostic of how to appropriately facilitate a world passing over into a more comprehensive version of itself. So the philosopher has a diagnostic knowledge, a comprehension of not knowing. The philosopher knows, oh, each of those moments and each of those worlds that I've passed through ultimately was a contradiction in some sense and passed over into a new world. And now I know which worlds lead to more comprehensive worlds because of which ones are being disqualified. So that now I know that I'm not any one of those particular selves, and that thinkers, other people who are in these particular worlds, I know how to not only enter into those worlds, but also how to take them to their ends so that they could become something else. So the philosopher knows not knowing. The not knowing of each of these developmental positions is something that the philosopher has knowledge of. They comprehend themselves in the knowledge of having passed through each of these moments of not knowing. The philosopher knows what it's like to be ignorant or undeveloped, and is capable of setting the conditions for others of getting into a new, possibly better, more comprehensive worldview. Approaching the close here. So insofar as the philosopher reproduces in knowledge and in tradition its way of life, it's ultimately something that comes across to me anyway as sustainable. So questioning, for example, like I suggested before, suggested that there was no anterior to doing philosophy, where as soon as you're questioning, as soon as you're called to question, you're already positing the condition of what philosophy would be, i.e. being called and then coming to answer it possibly, or approximating an answer. And then by the very fact that one is questioning, one is already fulfilling the condition of pursuing an answer and thereby doing philosophy. So in this sense, philosophy has a kind of circular sustainability to it. It becomes what it is as soon as it's called into question. It can't be other than that. Not quite what I'm trying to say there. What I also want to try to suggest, or at least leave as a loose end, is that this self-conscious, self-appropriating process doesn't have an apparent end. So the philosopher might be able to stop at some point taking up different worldviews within the tradition, but one never really stops encountering different people. So this process of like continually being able to and trying to approximate where the other is coming from is something that never really comes to an end. So it's a self-conscious and self-appropriating process without an apparent end. And this, to me, strikes as a form of sustainability where the goal of the discourse is not the consumption of theory or the reproduction of theory or the printing of books, but is a kind of way of relating to people that could be passed on indefinitely. This way of relating, to me, at this point, doesn't seem to have any kind of terminus that would suggest that it ought not to be passed on or couldn't be passed on or would stop being able to be passed on at some point. It seems sustainable in that sense. One could keep doing it without contradiction, even if one didn't find it overly coherent in my presentation. So I'm going to close out now by contradicting myself, by giving you all a thought experiment. So recall what I said about thought exercise and thought experiments earlier, where a thought experiment is kind of paltry because it only gives you a edificatory glimpse or insight into what another thinker's world might be like, and then you're prompted to get into it or not get into it. Whereas a thought exercise, the whole point is to be able to set the conditions for getting into that thinker's world. But with this tension in mind, with this very distinction in mind of a thought exercise, we can remake a traditional thought experiment with the kind of philosophical persona that I have in mind. So think now to the traditional model of Plato's cave, or of kind of if I'm tied down in a cave and I am tricked my entire life that the appearances on the wall cast by fire and by puppets, if I think the reality is the appearances on the wall cast by the shadows, then as a philosopher, the goal is to see those as mere appearances and find one's way out of the cave in some sense, or maybe differently, to see how the outside of the cave was already immanent inside of the cave. I'm not sure how much that one makes sense at this point. But anyway, the whole idea here, what's important to keep of this Platonic model idea, this traditional model idea, is that the goal was to get out of mere appearances and to get up into the realm of truth, to see things how they really were, to glimpse the in itself, or to overcome myself so as to see things how they truly are, to overcome my mere finitude in the world and to see the infinite or something. That's the general model, but like I said, I want to give a new thought experiment that appropriates that along these aforementioned lines of what it means to make sense by going world to world and generating a sense of each of those worlds and synthesizing a self that as opposed to merely having the sensory apparatuses that our biology affords us, now you have all of these intellectual senses that different people in their lived lives have embodied and left for us, left for others. So there's that distinction between thought experiment and thought exercise, and there's also the way that I framed making sense. Those are both functioning in the background here moving forward. So now finally, to reappropriate Plato's cave, we could think that, say you're in the cave, but you're blindfolded, and you have no way of taking the blindfold off. You have no way of taking off your rose-colored glasses. But somebody's told you that there's such a thing as sight, or sight that's not mediated by the redness of your glasses. I'll drop that part to try to be silly about glasses, but blindfolded. You're blindfolded. You're blindfolded. But you've been told about sight, and you're in this cave. So what you can do when you enter into each of these worlds, it's the same as kind of reaching out and touching the walls of the cave by getting into the worldviews. So there's a worldview here, worldview here, worldview here, at each of your sides of worldviews all around you. And those are all the means by which you're capable of moving around in the cave. And if you never take up any of these worldviews, you'll only ever just think that the one that you're always already in is the only one, and that that one's real, and that that self that is in it is real. But the whole point is not that you need to get out of the cave, but that you can figure out what the knowledge of seeing must be if you're capable of inhabiting these worlds and moving out to the edge of each of the cave walls. So you're blindfolded, you've been told about sight. You don't actually need to come to know what sight is like, because each of these worldviews provides you a sense of where the walls are around you. And then once you've sensed all of the wall around you with each of these worldviews and provided senses, you basically know the contours of the cave in the exact same way that you would know them if you had just a kind of immediate non-blindfolded vision of them. So in this model, there's no need to get outside of the cave, nor is there a need to kind of have like a Big Bang religious experience where now you know that you're this particular kind of self. I'm not overly sure that the ecstatic model even works like that, like getting outside of yourself kind of model. But in this model, it's about mediating each of the possible worlds with one's attempts to get into them. And insofar as one is persistent in their questioning and attempting to get into these worlds and exercising their imagination, they are taking up this kind of philosophical tradition and explicating it for others. So I'll end here now with a quick quip. If the world as it really is capable of supporting all of these lived worlds, these many synthetic worlds, then in one sense it seems tragic to be unenriched by them or by a plentitude of them. Seems almost a tragedy not worth living if one could only be in one of these worlds and not synthetically move among them or something. But if the world as it really is capable of supporting all these worlds, then it seems truer to how the world really is if we can say that it could be many ways, and then to show how it is those many ways as the lives of the people in it. So it's truer to the way the world is if the world can be many ways, to show how the world actually is many ways and how it supports all of those lived worlds, all of those different many ways. And in this sense, as opposed to needing to get outside of oneself or something to one's worldview to get out to the way the world actually is, one gets more of the way the world actually is by having all of these many worldviews and being this synthesizing self that moves among them. Quoting something like, it's Adventure Time. I got this quip from Adventure Time, where one of the there's a robot character, and then there's who's determined to act in the way that the world is, and then there's a robot character who has imagination, who can't see the world the way that it actually is. And the determined robot says to the other one, BMO is their name, you are freer than I am, because I can only see the world as the way that it is. You are better off because you can see the world in all these ways that it could be, and in a sense have a truer access, a truer vision to how the world is because of all the ways that it could be. So in that sense, there's no need for the Platonic model of getting outside of these worldviews to check to see how the world actually is, but of taking up as many of these worlds as possible, synthesizing them, and seeing how high it goes, seeing how much one could comprehend, and seeing the kind of self that comes out the other side.